Many people may know the myth of Sisyphus in one form or another, but one of the most influential, famous forms of it was told by Albert Camus. And I want to share this story, the version of the story that he shared, and also respond to it in a sense, as in use it as a way of responding to where we see people, society, we live in a society, but just all the world right now, and the dominant ideology that is pushing our world like a boulder. So in Camus' version of the story, his point was that life itself was, or is, absurd. And you can understand then why he was selecting this particular story, because it's the task that's absurd within the myth of Sisyphus, the task of rolling a boulder up a mountain forever. Potentially there was an end goal. Potentially there could have been a way to end this endless cycle. But the point of this task in the first place was, after all, torture. It was something set by the gods to torment Sisyphus and to wear down Sisyphus and ultimately destroy him mentally, potentially physically. Just the idea that you're pushing it up, comes down, and it's an impossible task. The reason it would be an impossible task is because the boulder naturally wants to go down the hill or the mountain. And the reason it would be an impossible task is because the boulder naturally wants to go down the mountain every single time you push it up. It has to do with the boulder is some rock from another place and another time, and it doesn't exactly fit right there. It naturally is round. It naturally conforms to the whims of gravity and wants to go back down the mountain. And the mountain itself is a different rock, different mineral composite, perhaps, who knows? But certainly it's fundamentally different, and it's a different shape. And therefore, just because you have this round peg, square hole, something like that, they don't fit together. They naturally oppose each other, and the boulder just naturally, constantly, endlessly conforms to its own nature of wanting to go back down and to not occupy the place at the top of the mountain. It just fundamentally does not fit there. So that's Camus' version of why life is meaningless. In his view, it's because you have this kind of endless task and you're performing it for no particular reason, other than, in actuality, in this version of the story, it would be to be tortured by someone else for that other person's amusement. But in Camus' version of the story, the happiness that Sisyphus is able to find and the meaning that he is able to find within this task is actually in finding joy. Somehow, in some way, he finds joy in what he does, enjoys it, doing it over and over again. And that seems to reflect at least the proposed worldview that Camus had, though we'll get to it. Potentially he doesn't live his life in that exact way. Well, now, here's where my disagreements come up, because I have a very different worldview. And it's worth noting that when I first read this essay when I was in college and was part of a philosophy class, I actually did enjoy this essay. And it can potentially tell you a lot about how much views can change. One thing, when you're an impressionable college student that should have learned better when I was back at home, but, I didn't have the time in college to look more into what these kind of people believe, how they actually live, and the consequences of what they propose. And for that matter, you always write in a pretty positive way about these essays because you have to do well in the class. So eventually you just kind of get pushed into actually thinking something positive about these essays, which means then that you think something positive about the worldview. So now for my modern update and response. Well, if, let's say, I were given this task, and if the point was just to get the boulder to the top of the mountain, then I would definitely say I have a couple alternatives in how I would actually accomplish this task, finish it, and then move on to whatever next comes. So first option is just cut the boulder. Just chip away at it. You have forever anyways, so why not just chip away at it and make it squared off so that then you can move it up the mountain and it won't instantly roll down because you fundamentally changed its form. You have brutally, harshly changed its entire nature in order to make it actually function and fit with the location that it's intended for, the location that it's intended to occupy. Now, similarly, and in opposition to that, if we just had to keep the boulder the exact same shape, no matter what, for some reason it has to be the exact same shape, and we also still need it to be atop the mountain, well, another option is, of course, to reshape the mountain. Again, we have forever, so I'm going to chip away at that mountain. Maybe I'm even going to use dynamite, but just destroy it, absolutely destroy it to create a ramp and to make enough ramps and notches, tunnels, whatever it takes to make sure that by the end it's relatively easy to put that boulder atop the mountain. Now, you can see in either scenario, I've changed one form or another. I've changed the entire nature of one or the other so that they actually start to work together. And this would be if I was, for that matter, really interested in finishing this task. So that's one option. Another, I guess, just emotional option would be to say, this task is intended to be impossible. It's intended to be torture. It's intended just to destroy the person who is doing this task, and it's set by the powers that be. So another option would be, let's say, if I'm going to be tortured anyways, just turn to Zeus and say, no, I'm not going to shoulder this boulder forever. I'm not going to do it. I'm just giving up. And you know what? Maybe then Zeus would have one of two things. The gods in general would have one of two things. Either another torture laid out where they would actually have to apply it themselves instead of it being something that I am asked to apply against myself. Or maybe that was the idea all along, that you don't have to do it, really, and therefore they'll just let you go. Who knows until you really ask? So here's the reason for my response in this particular form, this sort of rewriting of the original story. So Camus, he still acted in a lot of ways like life had plenty of meaning. He was politically active, he was a socialist, and he was pretty interested in these victim narratives. For his time and place, it was about Arabic people in France, and so he wanted to write these characters every now and then, which were an Arab, and they were treated oh so harshly and unfairly by the French people there. Now, it's a slightly different situation. He's talking about a different group of Arabs than the present day ones. But if he really thought that his own life was meaningless, it's telling that he still treated certain groups of people, especially the victim groups, some grievance groups, as if their lives were of great import. So for me and my new and better worldview, I really can't see life as meaningless. I see instantly a lot more meaning when I care about my own kin, my own people. If I'm interested in preserving them and having a future, that seems to be a great task and one that has a hopefully bright future if we can accomplish what we really want to accomplish. And even if it's still a very harsh future, the absolute state we're in right now does fill me with a visceral need to do this. And this shift in thinking is actually really good for me because, unlike Camus, when I'm doing this and when I'm thinking more collectively, when I'm thinking about my group instead of a very generalized or a very individualist way of thinking, I suddenly see much more value in life. Because the individualist, especially the nihilist individualist that Camus sort of represents, is basically you live and you die, and that's why he justified this myth as a metaphor for life itself and saying, oh, it's pointless. So with this fundamentally different worldview, what does my telling of the story sort of add to it? Well, it's a new metaphor basically, but I'd say that it still addresses the same things, but with, I would argue, a much more realistic worldview. You're the people harmed by pushing this boulder, and the intention in giving that task in the first place was to have something that could not be accomplished and would just ultimately break you down. So here's my challenge. Should someone with drawing skills choose to accept it, I would like to see a cartoon. And the picture will be Sisyphus pushing the boulder up the mountain. And on the side of the mountain, maybe you can integrate it into the drawing more nicely, it will be written Western civilization on the incline. And then on the boulder, you can write non-Western peoples. And then for Sisyphus, you write on his back probably Westmen. And then you have a little child Sisyphus, Sisyphus Jr., coming up behind. And in a little speech bubble, Sisyphus can say to little Sisyphus Jr., "One day, I'll leave this to you." Now, with a cartoon like that, I think you can sort of see my horror, absolute horror, at looking back and seeing people still pushing the boulder, still knowing after so many decades that that's not in the boulder's nature to be what it's not. Like I said, the boulder is a lovely boulder. It's just lovely. But it's not the same rock as the mountain, and it's not in the form with the mountain where they naturally harmonize. They just don't. They don't conform to each other. They don't support each other. They don't help each other. They are directly wanting to have different forms and different functions by their very nature, coming especially from their form and composition and prior locations all at once. And to Camus and all the other people that basically agree with his worldview, when you look back, do you care about Sisyphus and Sisyphus Jr.? Or do you ultimately care about the boulder? And do you care about the mountain? There's a simple solution to this, and a simple solution that makes everyone more happy and more aligned to their own nature. Don't do this thing which, from its very inception, was designed to be torture. Live a life that is fulfilling, meaningful, and cares. Cares to actually protect, defend, make better. And I promise you that along the way, as you're working for positivity here, you really won't end up thinking in the same way as Camus did.